and thanks for joining us. Cochise County is in the southeastern corner of Arizona. 6,000 square miles of what in the early 1900s was one of the country's most robust economies, made so by copper, cattle, and abundant crops. Today, it's a different story. About 130,000 people, nearly 20% of them living in poverty. Copper is gone, ranching in the traditional sense is fading. But there are new developments in Cochise County's economy as the area draws big money attention. Men from some of the richest families in the country purchase large swaths of land in Cochise County, and California farmers have begun planting crops there. In Wilcox, Howard Buffett, son of billionaire Warren Buffett, runs a big farm as part of a research project. He owns one ranch along the border and is buying another, all totaling about 1,500 acres. Near Douglas, another 80,000 acres now under the control of sports mogul Stanley Kroenke, married to a Walmart heiress, owner of the soon-to-be Los Angeles Rams, and part owner of the NBA's Denver Nuggets and the Avalanche professional hockey team. Big names, big dollars in a small county. What does it mean, and what's happening to Cochise County as a result? Some say it's about the most valuable of Western commodities, even more valuable than land. It's about water. We begin our coverage with Arizona Public Media's Zach Ziegler taking us to the Bowie area, a hot spot for the tree nut industry, and what the planting of these water-intensive crops means there.
Late last August, the water table in Bowie dropped so low that the town's 2 municipal wells stopped working. That left the town without water for 3 days. The problem started earlier in the week with well number 2.
And then we noticed within 3 or 4 days, number 1 well was start acting up.
Both wells were out of commission and needed to be drilled deeper to a depth of more than 100 feet below the surface.
The number 1 well, the smaller well, we extended it 60 feet, and then we got water.
The wells going dry was an extreme example of the community's water issues.
We have been asked several times by the water company to cut down on our water usage because there was a shortage.
It wasn't always this way. Water levels in Bowie were stable through the 1980s and into the 90s. An Arizona Department of Water Resources monitoring station nearby measured water at depths between 96 and 100 feet. But in mid-1998, levels dropped below 100 feet and have been going down ever since. The last measurement, taken a month ago, shows levels dropping to 113 feet below the surface. The water issues in Bowie have left many residents with clear thoughts on who is responsible. They point to expansion in the area's major industry, pecan and pistachio farming.
The shortage, of course, won't go away for several reasons. One being all the extra planting they're doing at the moment. And secondly, there just isn't that much water in a desert.
Locals are quick to say the new farmers are from out of state. Of all the land sold in the San Simon Valley since 2010, about a third was bought by companies headquartered out of Arizona. The locals fear swaths of land are ending up in the hands of out-of-state farmers who don't have sustainable, long-term farming in mind.
That group of people will not have to face the consequences of developing the property because they're simply not going to be here in 20 years.
Mark Cook is a second-generation Bowie farmer who has partnered with some of those he calls that group of people. He's expanded his family's property and operations in Cochise County, working with a California family that has farmed pistachios and almonds there for 40 years. Together, they've bought 12,000 acres in Cochise County since 2010. About half of that land is in the Bowie area. The trees are planted, and the growers are waiting for them to mature and produce nuts. That takes about 7 years. Once mature, a pecan tree can live for up to 100 years, a pistachio tree 150. Cook says that's why managing water supply is in their best interest. Operate in the red for the early years, and then in the black for decades. But it's hard to do that if others use the water they're counting on.
Our group has about 2,500 acres or so still sitting vacant, particularly here around Bowie, simply because we don't believe that it can be supported for 50, 60, 70 years like we'd like it to be.
That's part of the plan for Cook and his partners. He estimates 6,500 acres they own will remain vacant. More than a third of that is near Bowie. The point? Buy land so no one else can plant trees on it. Cook says he knows locals may question his motives, but he says he is in it for the long haul.
We're trying to develop something that we're going to hand to our grandkids. And that right there, simply put, may be the answer.
Cook and other large farmers even asked the state to prevent anyone from adding new wells on farmland in the area. That would have also capped any agricultural wells not currently in use. The state denied the request, so farmers who aren't keeping sustainability in mind can continue their practices. Cook says there's a good chance the water table will continue to drop if things go as they are. It also means the water district's Dan Oneal will continue to struggle to keep the water running in Bowie. August's crisis pretty much depleted the district's emergency fund. The town needs around $80,000 to finish well repairs. Monthly revenues are usually under $7,000, and expenses eat up virtually all of that money.
We were trying to research and find some grants that we can get a hold of, and try to find someone that got big pockets that'd like to give us a little bit of money and help us.
And if a 5-figure fix seems difficult, O'Neill's biggest hope, a new well, seems completely out of reach.
And I'd like to put a new one in, but that's an arm, leg, 6 fingers, and a toe right there. That's too expensive. It runs around $400,000.
And if recent unsustainable practices continue to draw down groundwater faster than nature replenishes it, Bowie and other communities in the area will continue to struggle to dig deep enough wells to get their water.
Here's a look at the recently purchased acreage in the San Simon Valley. This map shows an area north of I-10 and east of the Wilcox area to the county line. About 4,000 acres connected to farmer Mark Cook, from whom you just heard from. Another 2,000 from A&P, the Hewler's company, the Californians that Cook partnered with. Nearly 4,000 by other California farmers, and more than 17,000 acres purchased by farmers in states other than California and Arizona. So is something monumental about to happen in Cochise County, or is this all happenstance? Ann English is a Cochise County supervisor, a longtime educator in the area. She and her family live on a farm with its own well. Here's her take on what's happening in rural southeastern Arizona. We've got these millionaires, in some cases billionaires, moving into Cochise County. Why is there a sudden interest in this area?
I think because the land is less expensive than it is in many parts of the country, and there's still the availability of water. So if they're interested in farming, then there's going to be a need for water, and that's drawing many of them here.
How long will this last?
It will last as long as it's economically feasible. And the water table, we're not in a closed basin, but the water table, of course, is not infinite. But there is a point where you can't drill any deeper because financially it's not going to work. You can't pull the water out of the ground cheap enough to grow a crop. So usually it happens in stages. The smaller farmers go under first, and those that can have the longest straw stay on the longest. But they're always looking out for the best deal because they're in business. And so they're going to go where they can make a margin of profit after paying the expenses of the land and the fertilizer and whatever it takes to grow that crop.
So a lot of what we're seeing is happening in the Wilcox area. Why isn't it happening in other places of Cochise County?
Well, it's happening here, but you don't see it as much because many of the farms are off the main highway or off the road so that you don't see them. There are thousands of acres in the Elfrida area and on south to Douglas that have been started in farming again, let's put it that way, since it's a non-expansion area in the last 2 or 3 years. And that's the reason the farm crops are getting a good price right now. You've seen a lot of silos go up in the valley so that they can store those products and wait for the market to change so that they can get a good price for them. A lot of the farming has also been the expansion of the pecans. So we have many pecan grows now in Cochise County, many of them not producing yet, but it takes about 4 or 5 years for them to start getting a pecan crop, but it's here.
Tell me a little bit about the water situation here in Cochise County. I mean, the history, the geography, what makes it so rich?
Well, I think that, we're standing near the Whitewater Draw, and in the background you see a windmill, And that's how we started with water here in the valley, and that's because we had farming taking place, but it was dry land farming. That meant they were dependent on rainfall to get the farm to work. As people started to grow more than their 20 acres or their 40 acres, then they started to look for a greater water source, and that's when wells became popular, and not wells that were by the windmill, but wells that had a submersible pump so that they could get water anytime they wanted it, whether the wind was blowing or not. These are still popular for people that are raising cattle, because that way you don't have to run them all the time. When you have cattle in that pasture, then you can set the windmill to work, and otherwise, you don't need the water coming out of the ground. Over time, the farming has changed here. We used to do row irrigation, and that wasted a lot of water. And water is costly because the water itself doesn't cost, but pulling it out of the ground costs. So every farmer, everyone who's concerned about the water, isn't just the fact that they are trying to conserve the water, they're trying to conserve the utility cost that it gets the water out of the ground. So almost every farm that you see now is very, very honed in on using the least amount of water in order to grow the particular crop that they're growing. Every pecan farmer that's gone in the last 5 years at least does drip irrigation now. So there's no more flood irrigation, wasted water in ditches and along roadways. So conservation has become the mantra for two reasons. One, because people think they should conserve. The other is because it costs them less to get it out of the ground if they're conserving the water they do bring up.
Cochise County has a very healthy water supply?
Well, Cochise County has several basins. So we're standing in one basin right now. This is the Douglas Basin. This is a non-expansion area. So that means that you have to have water rights that were established in the 80s, or you can't farm. Water rights means X number of acres that you are allowed to farm, not X number of gallons of water. Now, when you get past Elfrida, you get into another closed basin. They have no restrictions there. So the amount of pumping that's taking place there is much greater than what's taking place here because it's unlimited. If you go to the other side of the mountain, which is still in Arizona, is still in Cochise County, there's no restrictions there. So if someone wanted to farm over on the other side of the mountain, they could. It's a matter of what fits within the law structure of where you are. And in Arizona, the water is owned by the state of Arizona, technically. They say we have the right to determine who gets to use the water. Any individual, though, can drill what you call a domestic well. That means that I can have a garden, I can feed my family, I can have water for whatever I need to on my 1 acre, 5 acres, 10 acres. But if you go beyond 10 acres, then ADWR will get you in this area. Anywhere else in the state, unless they're in a management area, it's unrestricted.
A lot of farming, do we run the risk of things drying up down here?
You always run that risk when you have multiple users of a finite supply, and that's what water is. There's a finite amount of it. And unfortunately, the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years, we have been getting less and less rainfall in this area. 15 inches a year used to be normal. Now, sometimes it's 6, 7. So how do we replenish the water? Well, it has to fall from the sky. And if it isn't falling from the sky, then absolutely you're taking more out of the ground than you're putting into the ground. So there's not a balance there anymore.
This is big money. Is this good or bad for this community?
Well, real estate is one of those drivers of the economy. And when real estate becomes too expensive for whatever you're doing, whether it's a manufacturing and now they want to turn that area into something else, then you want to move out of that neighborhood that's going to give you high taxes, and you're going to move somewhere else. So I think what's happening in California is not only the lack of water, but the expense of the land. And they're able to sell it for subdivisions and get much more money for it than they can for growing lettuce or something else. So those farmers are looking, where is there water that we can go to? And many of them have spied Cochise County because we have water, because the land is inexpensive in comparison to other parts of the country.
The Howard G. Buffett Foundation is a private family foundation. According to its founder, Howard Buffett, he wants to transform some of the most impoverished and marginalized areas globally. Buffett says farming near Wilcox is one of the first steps in doing that. So Howard Buffett, how did you find Wilcox of all places?
Well, about 10 years ago, I started coming down to the border to do a lot of border ride-alongs with the Border Patrol, and I did that. ASU Foundation helped me set those up, and I used to fly over this area every time I'd go home back east, and I didn't know it was Wilcox, but I'd see all these circles, you know, all the pivot circles. And so then when we wanted to move some of our research from South Africa to the U.S., that was always, it just stuck in my head. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna go investigate that. So we did a little investigation and showed up in Wilcox and found actually this area is pretty conducive to what we wanted.
And what is it that you want out of this area for Africa?
Well, what we do here is we do a lot of research that will have drought tolerant or root uptake nutrient restrictions, and we're trying to overcome those. And so it's a good area because we can control the fact that it's all irrigated. We can control how much moisture it gets. So we can really stress out crops here if we want to. And where Purdue and Penn State work just east of here, that's a lot of what they do. Is you will go over and look at their test plots in summer, and they'll have some of those corn plants that are basically dead from lack of water. So they can really stress crops out. That's what we wanted.
What crops are we talking about in this area for you?
Primarily corn, although Purdue and Penn State, they do some research on different types of beans, but they're primarily working on corn. And our research that we're working on has a lot to do with water consumption, cover crops, and some of it we're actually trying to determine on different irrigation methods which ones are most efficient in terms of cost and use of water.
How soon before you can take what you're learning here and apply it there?
Well, that's the frustrating part. I mean, we've been doing some research in Illinois for the last 7 years on farms like this, but in Illinois we feel like we still don't have enough solid information. So, I mean, for me, if we have less than 10 years of information, I'm not very confident in it. Now, the one thing about Arizona is in 5 or 6 years, because it's much more consistent here in terms of the environment, that we probably will have pretty good information. In Illinois, we have such variation in the growing seasons, and we can't control the water like we can here. So it takes a little bit longer under those circumstances.
There's a lot of farming going on here in the Wilcox area. Are you worried that maybe word is catching on that this is the place to do it and you might not be able to keep doing your research here?
Well, we own the ground, so we can keep doing the research. I mean, unless we run out of water, and that's our biggest concern is water. I mean, you don't buy land here, you buy water. And so, different parts of this valley have better water. We're in an area here that's, I would say, moderate in terms of good water, and if you go east of here, it drops pretty quickly. And so, our challenge is having, adequate water. I think today, we probably have that. I don't know where we'll be in 10 years.
Some people might be totally stricken with the idea of Buffett is in Wilcox and he's doing great things. I mean, you've helped with the food bank, the sheriff's department. What is your interest in giving back to this community?
Well, we have a foundation that we typically, what we give away in a year is somewhere around $150 to $160 million a year. Now, most of that's international. A lot of it's in Africa. Some of it's in Central America and Mexico. But we have, a couple of things that we stick pretty consistent with, which is where we operate, we try to support the community. So we say no to a lot of things. And if it's outside of the community, we say no to it. And sometimes we try to stay with probably really 2 areas, which is food security and public safety. And public safety is pretty broad. I mean, we've supported, different drug intervention programs. We've supported, even in some areas in Arizona outside of Cochise County, we've supported some things that I would say that fall under the umbrella of immigration. And so, it's not 100% focused, but it's pretty focused.
You've been pleasantly surprised with Wilcox.
When we came here, we didn't really know what to expect. I think the first time you come to Wilcox, we had our foundation board meeting down here a few years ago, and it's mostly family that's on the board, and they are just like they're pretty surprised at what this farm looks like and what this area looks like. It's not what you expect. You say, well, you're going to Arizona, they think you're in the desert. And, it's pretty developed in this area. And there's some really good farmers here. I mean, one thing, when you're in an area that is challenging with water and environments that stress crops, you have to be a good farmer. I mean, poor farmers don't last down here. So, you got to be pretty good at it. And we've really gotten to know some of the local people and some of the local farmers. And I tell you, Wilcox is a great little community.
Buffett isn't just farming in Wilcox. He's donated tens of thousands of dollars to the Cochise County Sheriff's Department and kick-started a food bank in Wilcox. His way, he says, of giving back to the community. And for a deeper analysis on the Cochise County land rush, I'm joined by my colleagues here at Arizona Public Media, Christopher Conover and Zach Ziegler. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Zach, we'll start with you. This has literally been a work in progress for months now.
Yes, when you hear reference to the issues in Bowie that started in August, that's when I started to see this. That's when I started to look into this story. I put in a public records request after repeatedly hearing that there's a lot of land being sold to California farmers, and that's the big issue here. I heard a lot of it anecdotally. I wanted to see if I could prove it. So I asked the assessor for land data in a large chunk of the area, basically anything north or east of Wilcox, and that's where we started to see some of this information, what had been sold there in the last 6 or so years. We really started to find out about who was buying land. We found some interesting people. Included in that was Howard G. Buffett.
And so public records request is initially how it got started. Howard G. Buffett has been a name in that area for the last 5 years. I think people have known about that. But then, Christopher, we start looking at some other names and stumble across somebody like Stanley Kroenke, and how does that name ring a bell to most of us?
To most of us, that name rings a bell because he owns the St. Louis, now the Los Angeles Rams football team. So he was in the news a lot, in the sports news in recent weeks. He owns other professional teams. He owns a team in the National Hockey League and the National Basketball Association. He owns an English Premier League soccer team. He is a cattle rancher, land developer. He owns the Elcon Mall in Tucson. And while Zach was doing land purchases, I started on land leases, which again are public records. And that's where we started finding all these different names. Now, Howard Buffett, Stan Kroenke do not lease or purchase land in their own names. They're all in corporations. So we had to go through the Corporation Commission to figure out who these people were and trace backwards. But this was all done through public records. And what we found with Kroenke was that, for example, I found he has almost 60,000 acres under lease in Cochise County. And he has about 25,000 acres of purchase. All sum total, he has under his control about 2% of Cochise County.
That's along the Arizona, New Mexico, Mexico border lines there. He is a cattle rancher. He has up to 6 cattle ranches in the U.S., others in Canada, and this is part of his business. But we are still unclear as to how he found Cochise County. We should note that we made repeated phone calls to his office. We had conversations with people, though we couldn't quite pin down how he found the area or maybe what the long-term plan is for that region.
Exactly, but he is a cattle rancher in other states. And if you look at the map that we have up, the dark green and the light green are the Kroenke properties. The bright green, if you will, is the purchase. The dark green is the lease. This is not out of the realm for him. He has ranches all over the West and one up in Canada also.
And it's not like this is new operations to this land. This has been traditionally ranched cattle land for going back even generations.
Let's go back up to the Bowie, Kansas settlement, Wilcox area, a longtime agriculture community, a lot of, I think, corn, tree nuts, cattle in that area. Also one cattle or dairy farm now under the control of a Minnesota farmer, Zach.
Yes, one of the other big purchasers we found in the area was Coronado Farms, as recently as 2015, acquiring land in the area, about 5,000 acres. They run cattle on that land. Christopher actually found out they had to move the cattle in from New Mexico because the previous owner took all of their cattle with them. So once again, it was cattle land. It stays as cattle land. This was just one of the many uses for this area that at times can concern people over water use. While a lot of the vegetation that cattle may be eating, as far as the grasses naturally occur there, things like alfalfa and corn do not occur in the area. When you plant it, it starts taking up water, and you have to start pulling up water to keep it going.
And those crops are big water users. And Christopher, you spoke with a water expert at the University of Arizona. What did she say about what's happening in that region?
The good news is for people in that region is the aquifers are strong there. There's not a lot of surface water. For example, in Phoenix and Tucson, we get a lot of our water from the Colorado River or the Salt River. That's surface water. Aquifers are groundwater. There are good aquifers in that area. Of course, like we saw in Bowie, they can get pumped down. The aquifers won't go dry. It just becomes a question of, is it economically feasible to make that straw longer and longer to get into those aquifers? But there is good water there. But tree nuts and alfalfa and things like that take a lot of water.
As we heard Howard Buffett say, I mean, you have to be a good farmer to farm in the desert, and that's what we're seeing in Wilcox, San Simon Valley area. Financially, this sounds very expensive for some of these investments that they're making, Christopher.
It is not cheap. Land is not necessarily cheap, but the leases are not terribly expensive when you look out. For example, Stan Kroenke spent about $100,000, $101,000 last year on his leases. Buffett spent about $5,200 last year on his leases. So the leases are cheap compared to actually purchasing them, but that is still, especially $100,000, even if you are a billionaire, that is a good chunk of money.
And we should note leases from the state, so there is...
Yes, state trust land.
Okay. Zach?
And when we're talking about purchases, to look at kind of a counter example, the Hewlers and the Cooks have spent nearly $50 million purchasing the land that they have gotten. So it is notably cheaper to lease it and to hold on to the land that way. But then again, if you want to make sure you hold on to it, as we heard Mark Cook talking about, he wants to make sure that land is in his control so that no one else develops there. The best way to go about it is to spend the dollars and buy it.
And as he said, though, save some of this land for future generations so that it can continue to be used for what these people are hoping is the intention, and that's agriculture.
Exactly, and we should point out with these leases, it's specific. These are grazing leases, or for the Cooks and the Hewlers, these are agricultural leases. It's not as though these folks could take them and lease the land and then grow houses, as they say, on them. They're very specific what they can be used for.
All right, gentlemen, great work. Thank you so much for your insight, and we look forward to future reporting. And that's our program. Thank you so much for joining us. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera.